My name is Iris Dalton. I am 29 years old. And the night I found out my parents had lied to me about the house, I was sitting in the parking lot of a Kroger on Brant Pike at 9:52 p.m., still in my work blazer, eating a granola bar because I had not had time to make dinner in 3 days. That detail matters. Because before I tell you what I found on my phone that night, I want you to understand what my life looked like during the 8 months I was told, over and over again, that my family was handling things. That the house situation was complicated. That my parents were stressed and I should give them space to figure it out. That being a good daughter right now meant staying patient and staying in my lane. I had been staying in my lane for 8 months. And every single day of it, I was the one keeping the house standing. The house was on Belhus Drive, a split level my grandparents built in 1971 and left to my parents when my grandmother passed. It sat on the edge of a quiet street in Tip City, just north of Dayton, the kind of neighborhood where the neighbors still wave from driveways and the oak trees are older than anyone living on the street. My mother, Patricia, grew up in that house. My father, Gerald, proposed to her in the backyard. My brother Marcus and I spent every summer there as children, and after my grandmother went, my parents said they would decide what to do with it as a family when the time was right. What as a family, when the time is right, meant in practice. My parents kept the property without formally listing it, let my father's declining health delay every decision, and quietly let me absorb every cost and errand associated with keeping the place functional while they figured out what they actually wanted. My father had a cardiac event in October of 2024. Not a full heart attack. The doctors at Miami Valley Hospital called it a serious arrhythmia with an associated blockage that required 2 stents and 4 days in the cardiac ICU. He came home October 19th. I was there for the discharge paperwork and the wheelchair push to the car. My mother, Patricia, had a standing Thursday appointment with her book club that afternoon that she did not cancel. She said my father would want her to maintain her normal routine because disruption caused everyone more stress than the thing you were trying to avoid. I did not argue with that logic. I did not argue with it for a long time. For the next 8 months, I drove my father to his follow-up appointments with his cardiologist, Dr. Emmett Kwan, at the Kettering Health Heart Center on Wilmington Pike. Tuesdays and alternating Thursdays. I drove 40 minutes each way from my apartment in Huber Heights, coordinated his prescriptions with the pharmacy on Miller Lane, tracked the refill windows on his blood thinners so there was never a gap, and monitored his dietary restrictions because my mother found the low-sodium guidelines confusing and kept forgetting which soups were safe. I printed a laminated sheet and put it on the refrigerator door. She thanked me for it and then left it facing the wrong direction for 6 weeks. I also managed the Belhus property. My parents had stopped paying the quarterly maintenance fees to the home warranty company in the spring of 2024, right around the time my father's health first started worrying them, so I picked those up without announcement, $287 per quarter, to keep the coverage active on the furnace, roof, and plumbing. In November of 2024, a section of the back fence collapsed from water rot after 2 days of heavy rain, and I contacted a local contractor named Walt Greer, who had done work on my grandparents' property years earlier. He came out on a Saturday, confirmed it was a full panel replacement, and billed $1,340, which I paid directly. My parents said they would reimburse me when things settled down. In February of 2025, I drove to Belhus Drive on a Sunday morning because my mother had mentioned the furnace was making a sound she couldn't describe. The filter was overdue, and the sump pump was cycling at an interval that meant the float switch was failing. Walt Greer came out again. The switch replacement cost $214. My parents said the same thing they had said in November. In March, I renewed the property's liability insurance rider because the annual renewal had lapsed after my father forgot to return a form to the insurance company. That was $438. I kept every receipt in a folder on my laptop desktop that I had named, without irony, Belhus Admin. Every time I raised the question of what would eventually happen to the house, my mother would say some version of the same sentence. We're working through the details, Iris. Your father's health comes first. We'll sit down and talk it through as a family when the time is right. I believed this. I believed it for the same reason most people believe things their parents tell them, not because the evidence supports it, but because the alternative is a kind of grief you are not ready to carry yet. My brother Marcus, during all of this, came to see my father twice. He lived in Columbus, 45 minutes away, and had recently become seriously involved with a woman named Brooke, who had 2 young children from a previous relationship. Marcus's life was full and demanding, and I understood that. Both visits he made were on weekends, once in December, once in February, and both times I had already been there the week before to restock the refrigerator, confirm the medication schedule, and leave a printed summary of my father's upcoming appointments on the kitchen counter so my parents wouldn't have to search for it. Marcus would arrive, sit with my father in the living room, watch whatever game was on, and leave after a few hours. He always hugged my father at the door for a long time. Once, he cried quietly on the porch. My father patted his back and called him his boy. I want to be fair to Marcus. He loved my father. That was not a performance. What I observed, though, was that love in his case expressed itself in the moments that felt meaningful, while the administrative weight of my father's recovery distributed itself invisibly onto the person who showed up on Tuesdays and alternating Thursdays regardless of what else was happening in her life. There were Tuesdays when I drove to Kettering Health straight from a full workday and sat in the cardiology waiting room reading the same 4 magazine covers for 90 minutes because Dr. Kwan was running behind. There were Thursdays in January when the roads were bad, and I left my apartment at 6:40 a.m. to give myself time, drove in the gray pre-dawn with the heater running loud, and arrived to find my father already dressed and waiting at the front door with his jacket button wrong. I would fix it in the entryway without saying anything about it, and he would say, "I was going to get that," and I would say, "I know, Dad," and we would walk to the car. I kept a small notebook in the center console of my car where I wrote down anything the doctor said that my father might not remember clearly by the time we got home. Which readings were normal, which ones to watch, when to call if the fatigue crossed a certain threshold. My father's short-term memory was not impaired, but he was tired in the specific way cardiac recovery makes a person tired. A heaviness in the attention, a tendency for things to slip. So I kept the notebook. My mother never asked to see it. I don't think she knew it existed. There were also the phone calls. My mother called me an average of 4 times a week during that period, not to ask how I was doing, but to relay logistics she didn't want to manage herself. Iris, the pharmacy said his prescription ran out, but I don't think it did. Can you check? Iris, the home warranty company keeps calling about something with the Belhust water heater, and I don't have time to deal with it. Can you handle it? Iris, the visiting nurse is coming Tuesday, but I scheduled a hair appointment. Is that okay? Each call was small. The accumulation of them was not small. What I understood, over time, was that my mother had sorted her children into 2 categories without ever announcing it. Marcus was the one whose time was valuable, and I was the one whose time was available. She had not decided this maliciously. She had simply never decided otherwise. Before I tell you what I found in that parking lot, tell me something. Tell me what time it is where you are right now, and whether it's light or dark outside where you're sitting. Because when I found what I found, it was full dark, 9:52 p.m., and the parking lot lights were casting everything in that flat yellow that makes the world look like it's inside a photograph someone took by mistake. I think the light you're in might change how this part feels. My father was cleared by Dr. Kwan on June 3, 2025. I know that date precisely because I was in the waiting room when the appointment ended, and my father came through the door looking lighter than he had in months, and he put his hand on my shoulder in the car and said quietly, "You've been a good daughter, Iris." I did not have anything to say to that. I just drove. My mother had made pot roast for dinner that evening, my father's favorite, and Marcus drove up from Columbus specifically to be there, which he mentioned twice during the meal, both times in a way that made the effort feel significant. I refilled everyone's water and did not mention that I had driven to Kettering Health 41 times in the past 8 months. 41. I had checked the Google Maps timeline out of curiosity in April, and the number had surprised even me. After dinner, while Marcus sat with my father in the living room watching baseball, my mother and I washed dishes together. She was in a good mood, brighter than I had seen her in a long time. She talked about replanting the back garden at Belhust, mentioned she had been in touch with an estate planning attorney about some paperwork, said everything was moving in the right direction. I asked, casually, whether that included the Belhust property. She said yes, absolutely. She and my father had been thinking it through and felt confident about where they were headed. I drove home that night feeling, for the first time in 8 months, like something was about to resolve. 11 days later, on June 14th, 2025, my mother called me at 4:17 p.m. She used the tone she reserves for announcements, the one that sounds measured and final, the tone of someone delivering a decision rather than inviting a conversation. She told me that she and my father had made their decision about the Belhust house. They had sold it. The sale had already closed, she said. A buyer had made an offer in late May, they had accepted, and the paperwork was complete. She meant April, actually, she misspoke. The closing was in April. The proceeds had gone toward my father's outstanding medical bills and a portion of their retirement account. My name was never on the deed, she reminded me, so legally there was nothing to divide. She hoped I understood that this had been the most responsible decision for the family as a whole. I sat in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, and I did not say anything for several seconds. Asked her what date in April the closing had happened. She said she would have to look it up. The details weren't really the point. I said I understood, and I thanked her for letting me know, and I got off the phone and sat there while the kitchen got dark around me, because I had not turned a light on and I did not get up to turn one on. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, and I want to be honest about it. It was not shock. That is the part that bothered me most, I think, later. It was not shock. It was more like the specific tiredness of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally set it down, except the thing they set down was the belief that their family was going to be fair. I set that down that evening, and I did not pick it back up. I drove to the grocery store because I needed to move. I needed to be somewhere that required me to behave normally, to hold a basket, to read labels, to stand in a checkout line. I needed the structure of an ordinary errand. In the parking lot at 9:52 p.m., I opened my phone. Not to call anyone. Not to compose a text I would regret. I opened the Montgomery County Auditor's website because the Belhust property tax reminder was still set in my calendar, a recurring alert I had created in November 2024 and never deleted, and I had a reflex, after 8 months of tracking that property's administrative deadlines, to check the record when I thought about it. I typed in the address. The property record loaded. Status. Active listing. I read that twice. Then I scrolled to the ownership history. There was a transfer recorded on April 22nd, 2025. The grantee, the new owner, was not a buyer. It was not any name I didn't recognize. The grantee was Patricia Dalton. My mother's name, listed as sole owner. The grantor was Gerald Dalton and Patricia Dalton, my parents jointly, releasing my father's interest. A quitclaim deed. The house had not been sold to anyone. My mother had moved the property from joint ownership into her name alone. April 22nd, 2025. I went back through my own records in my head. My father's discharge from the cardiac ICU, October 19th, 2024. The deed transfer, April 22nd, 2025, which was, I counted it, 3 days after my father's final pre-clearance appointment. The appointment in April where Dr. Kwan had said his recovery was progressing well, but he wanted one more set of imaging before the formal all-clear. 3 days after that appointment. At a time when my father was still managing fatigue, still adjusting his blood thinners, still in the stage of recovery where his judgment about paperwork and legal instruments was, at minimum, worth examining. The week of April 19th through 22nd, 2025, I had driven my father to Kettering Health twice. I had picked up a prescription refill. I had called the home warranty company about a minor issue with the Belhust water heater. I had all of this in my calendar, in my receipts, in my Google Maps history. Something in me loosened then, loosened the way a knot gives when it's been pulled past its tolerance and the rope finally finds its right length. Not anger. Not relief. Something more like clarity, the particular sensation of a long-running question becoming a statement. I sat in that parking lot for 22 minutes. I did not eat the granola bar. I took 3 screenshots of the property record, the status page, the ownership history, and the transfer date detail, and I texted them to my own email address, so I would have them in 2 places. Then I opened my contacts and found Christine Adler. Christine was a real estate and property attorney I had worked with 2 years earlier when I bought my apartment in Huber Heights. She was methodical and unhurried, and had the quality of someone who had heard every version of every property dispute and was no longer surprised by any of them. At the end of our closing, she had handed me her card and said, simply, that property questions had a way of returning. I had kept the card. I had put her number in my phone. I had never expected to use it for anything like this. I texted her at 10:17 p.m. I said, I think my parents transferred a family property during a period when I was the primary caregiver for my father. There may be a caregiver contribution issue and some questions about the transfer timing. Can we talk this week? She responded at 10:44 p.m. One sentence, yes. Call me Thursday at 9 a.m. I drove home. I did not cry that night, which I noticed. I had expected to. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and built a documentation folder I named Property Claim. I put inside it every invoice from Walt Greer, with the receipt photos I had taken out of General Financial Habit. Every text message from my mother asking me to call the pharmacy or confirm the visiting nurse schedule. Every credit card statement showing the quarterly maintenance fees, the sump pump repair, the insurance rider renewal. I exported my Google Maps timeline for the period October 2024 through June 2025 and highlighted the 41 trips to Kettering Health on Wilmington Pike. I included the dates, the durations, and the facility name each time. I did not send any of this to Christine yet. I saved the folder in 2 places and went to bed and slept for 6 hours, which was more than I had slept continuously in several weeks. My mother texted me the next morning to ask how I was doing, given the news about the house. She said she hoped I understood it had been the right decision for everyone's stability. I read the message twice, set the phone down, and made coffee. On Thursday, June 19, 2025, at 9:03 a.m., I called Christine Adler. She picked up on the second ring. I told her the entire timeline. My father's cardiac event in October. The discharge date. The 8 months of appointments, prescriptions, property maintenance. The transfer date of April 22nd. The quitclaim deed to my mother's sole name. The phone call on June 14th in which my mother told me the house had sold when it had not, in fact, sold to anyone outside the family. Christine listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked 2 things. First, had anyone ever made a written promise about my interest in the property? I said no written instrument, only repeated verbal statements from both parents that the house would be handled fairly as a family. Second, did I have documentation of every financial contribution I had made to the property during the caretaking period? I said yes, and I listed the categories. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, what you have described is a viable unjust enrichment claim in Ohio. You provided a measurable financial benefit to a property, maintained coverage, prevented depreciation, made structural repairs, under a reasonable expectation that your interests would be considered when that property's future was decided. The transfer to sole ownership, timed 3 days after a major medical appointment during an ongoing recovery period, raises questions worth examining carefully. She said she also wanted to pull the full conveyance record from the county recorder to see the deed's exact language and whether any consideration was listed. She said, do not contact your parents about any of this. Do not mention it to your brother. Let me pull the records and we'll talk again Monday. I said, okay. On Monday, June 23rd, Christine called me at 2:31 p.m. She had the full transfer documentation. The deed was a standard quitclaim form. She said, my father had signed over his interest in the property to my mother with no monetary consideration listed, meaning it was recorded as a gift transfer. She noted that quitclaim deeds executed during medically vulnerable periods could, in appropriate circumstances, warrant scrutiny around the signer's capacity and whether undue influence had shaped the decision. She was not alleging that this had happened, she said. She was saying the record created a question that a reviewing court or mediator would find relevant. She had also found something I had not anticipated. Within 7 days of the quitclaim transfer, specifically on April 29, 2025, the Belhus property had been listed for sale with a real estate agent named Sandra Osei at a brokerage in Troy. The listing price was $287,000. The property had been on and off the market since then, had received 2 offers that fell through, and was currently still active. The house my mother told me had already sold was still on the market, listed in her name alone, with proceeds that would flow entirely to her. I pulled up Sandra Osei's listing on my own phone after the call. The photos were professional, corrected lighting, wide angles that made the split level look larger than it was. Someone had staged the living room. The furniture arrangement was not the one my grandparents had kept for 40 years. The corner where my grandmother used to keep her upholstered reading chair was empty in the photos, just clean floor and a small potted plant positioned for visual balance. I looked at that corner for a long time. Then I closed the listing and set the phone down. What I understood, looking at those staged photographs, was the actual shape of what had happened. The quitclaim deed in April had not been a spontaneous estate planning response to a difficult year. It had been the first step in a planned sequence that included a realtor consultation, a listing agreement, and professional staging photography, all of which had occurred within 10 days of my father signing over his interest. Someone had made a plan before the deed was executed. The deed was not the decision. It was the paperwork that formalized a decision already made, at the moment my father was most fatigued and least likely to ask careful questions about what he was signing. I sat with that for a long time. Christine said, "I want to send a letter. Not a demand letter. Informational in tone. Letting your parents know that the documentation from your caretaking period exists, that you have counsel reviewing the transfer, and that you would like an opportunity to discuss a resolution before any further steps." "Sometimes," she said, "that is enough." I asked her what enough looked like. She said, "Sometimes families, when they understand that a careful record exists and that legal eyes are on a transaction, find it easier to make things right without a formal proceeding. Not always, but often enough to try first." The letter went out on July 2nd, 2025, certified mail to my parents' address, and by email to my mother. I know the exact hour it arrived because Marcus called me at 11:48 a.m. on July 3rd, and he did not say hello. He said, "What did you do?" I said I had retained counsel to review the property transfer and my caretaking contributions. He said, "Mom is completely devastated. You're doing this over a house? After everything Dad went through?" I said, "Marcus, I drove Dad to 41 appointments." There was a pause. I said, "I have the receipts. Literally, in a folder." He hung up. My mother called from an unknown number 12 minutes later because she assumed I was screening her calls. I was not screening her calls. I answered. She said my name in a voice I recognized, the voice she used when she needed me to understand the scale of what I was putting her through. She said this was completely unnecessary, that they had always intended to take care of me, that bringing a lawyer into this made them sound like criminals when they were my parents, and they had only been trying to protect the family's financial future in a very difficult year. I listened to all of it. I did not hang up. I let her finish. Then I said, "I know you're upset. I'm not angry. I just need the process documented. Christine Adler's number is on the letter. If you and Dad want to talk through a resolution, that's the right place to start." She started crying then. The real kind, not the managed kind. She said she had been so overwhelmed by her father's health, Iris, that she had made decisions too quickly and had meant to explain it properly and had not found the right moment. I believed that some version of that was true. I also believed that the right moment had been 9 weeks earlier when I asked her directly about the Belhust property over the phone, and she had told me the details weren't really the point. We did not speak again for 9 days. During those 9 days, my parents retained their own attorney, a man named David Spratt, who practiced estate law in Centerville. Christine and Spratt exchanged 2 letters in the first week of July. The first was formal positioning, each side establishing its understanding of the transaction and the basis for any claim. The second was more substantive. Spratt acknowledged that the timing of the quitclaim transfer relative to my caretaking period was a matter his clients were prepared to address in good faith and that they wished to explore a negotiated resolution. Christine told me this was meaningful movement. I told her I was still not angry. She said that was going to serve me well in the room. On July 14, 2025, a mediation session was convened at Christine's office in downtown Dayton, a 7th-floor suite with tall south-facing windows that let in a flat, honest light. My parents arrived first. My mother was wearing a gray blazer, her hair neatly done, the way she looked when she wanted to project that she had her footing. My father looked different from the last time I had seen him, smaller in some way, not physically but in his bearing, the particular contraction of a man who has understood something about himself that he would have preferred not to understand. He looked at me when I came through the door. He said, "Iris." I said, "Hi, Dad." That was all, before the mediation began. But it was enough. I could tell from the way he said my name, not defensive, not managing, that Sprat had shown him the 41 trips. That someone had finally put the number in front of him. The session lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. Christine presented the caretaking documentation systematically. The contractor invoices, the pharmacy records, the maintenance fee payments, the insurance rider, and the Google Maps timeline showing 41 trips to Kettering Health between October 2024 and June 2025. Sprat presented my parents' position, which had shifted considerably from the story my mother had told me on June 14th. They were not disputing my caretaking. They were not disputing the contributions. They were characterizing the quitclaim transfer as a routine estate planning measure and asserting that they had always intended to compensate me appropriately for my support. Christine asked, with the calm precision of someone who had done this hundreds of times, what appropriate compensation had been planned and when my parents had intended to communicate it to me. Sprat said his clients were prepared to make an offer. The offer was $47,500, structured as a family settlement payment acknowledging my financial contributions to the property during the caretaking period. I would receive the payment within 60 days and release any further claim. The house, still listed with Sandra Osei, would continue in my mother's name. Christine and I had already discussed the range she expected. We countered at $61,200, which reflected the full documented contribution amount plus a proportional recognition figure calculated against comparable Ohio caretaker contribution cases she had handled. Sprat and my parents conferred for 22 minutes in a side room. When they returned, my father sat down before my mother did. He looked at the table rather than at me. They accepted. The settlement agreement was signed at 4:09 p.m. on July 14, 2025. Christine filed the executed document with the court the following morning for record. The $61,200 arrived by wire on September 3rd, a Wednesday, while I was in a staff meeting. I felt my phone buzz in my pocket and checked it under the table. I did not show anyone the screen. I put the phone away and paid attention to the meeting. I went home that evening and made actual dinner for the first time in longer than I wanted to calculate. I reheated a pot of soup I had made on the weekend, sat at my kitchen table, and ate it while it was still warm, which sounds like nothing and felt like something I had not done in a long time. A few weeks later, I moved $1,627 from the settlement into a separate savings account. That was the exact figure. The fence replacement, the sump pump switch, the 3/4 of maintenance fees, and the insurance rider. The amount my parents had said they would pay back when things settled down. Things had settled down. The Belhust house sold in October of 2025 to a family from Cincinnati relocating for work. I know this because I checked the county auditor's record one last time, old habit, and the new owner's name appeared cleanly where my mother's had been. I looked at it for a moment. Then I closed the app and put my phone on the counter and did not look up the new family's name or think about what they would do with the backyard or whether they would notice the section of fence Walt Greer had replaced. Some doors close themselves. You only have to stop reaching back to hold them open. I still talk to my father. Not the way we talked before all of this. We have not found our way entirely back to ease, but I called him on his birthday in August, and we spoke for 23 minutes about baseball and nothing that required any courage to say. At the end, he told me it was good to hear my voice. I told him the same. We both meant it. I do not talk to Marcus. That is more his choice than mine, and I have decided to let it be his for now. My mother sends me birthday cards. She sent one in September with a short note that said she hoped I was well and that she thought about me. I texted her to say, "Thank you. That is the distance we are maintaining, and I have decided that distance can be a form of care when the alternative is a closeness that costs more than either person has left to spend." There is something I keep returning to, something I want to say plainly because it is the thing I wish someone had told me earlier. Patience is not the same thing as permission. Waiting for your family to do the right thing is not the same as agreeing that waiting is all you are allowed to do. The receipts you photograph out of habit, the reminders you never delete, the documentation folder you build on a Tuesday night in a grocery store parking lot. These things are not distrust. They are the quiet discipline of someone who has learned that goodwill, without a record, can be rewritten by anyone with a more convenient version of events. Keeping records did not make me calculating. Asking for documentation did not make me disloyal. Protecting what I had earned, in driving hours, in contractor invoices, in Tuesday and Thursday mornings on Wilmington Pike, did not make me selfish. Sometimes the most responsible thing you can do for yourself is put care and evidence in the same folder and know where both of them are. Before I leave you here, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is, because I started this story at 9:52 p.m. in a parking lot under yellow lights, and I want to know what light found you. And one more thing. If you were in Iris's position, if you searched that address and saw your mother's name on the transfer record, dated 3 days after your father came home from the hospital, would you have texted the attorney that same night? Or would you have called your parents first, given them the chance to explain it themselves? Let me know in the comments.